Diogenes of Sinope was the strangest of Greek philosophers and, quite possibly, the most bizarre figure from antiquity more generally. Born in 412 BCE, his father minted coins as his profession and, at some point, both father and son were involved in a scandal for allegedly striking the faces off of currency. Both were exiled and stripped of their citizenship. As the story goes, Diogenes became a wandering beggar and traveled to consult the oracle at Delphi about what he should do with his life now that he had lost his place in society. The oracle said to Diogenes, "Deface the currency." Diogenes didn't interpret this to literally mean he should go back to again physically striking the faces off coins, but rather that he should set about defacing the coins of custom, assumed wisdom, and cultural norms. In this manner, he could practice a unique brand of philosophy by calling into question the values and presumptions of Greek society. Thus began his bizarre philosophical career. No writings of Diogenes have survived. Instead, we now remember him for his bizarre, provocative, recorded behaviors. One could almost consider him to be history's first performance artist. For starters, he lived in a barrel and dressed in rags. His only possessions were a lantern, a cup, and a staff. His lifestyle makes someone like Socrates, another poor and mangy philosopher, appear bourgeois and indulgent by comparison. This, along with his proclivity for barking at passers-by, as well as for urinating, defecating, and pleasuring himself in public, earned Diogenes the nickname the Dog. These acts were performed as a form of philosophical stunt work to shock people out of their complacency. Diogenes would often be seen walking backwards, and when mocked by others, he would shout, "Aren't you ashamed, you who walk backward along the whole path of existence, and blame me for walking backward along the promenade?" Another famous story says that one day Diogenes visited the marketplace in broad daylight with a lantern, peering closely at everyone he passed, saying, "I'm looking for a human being." The point he was trying to make was that the people of the marketplace had all lost touch with their true human natures. Despite these eccentricities, Diogenes grew to be quite famous in his time. It's also said that no less a luminary than Alexander the Great himself, after meeting Diogenes, remarked that, "Had I not been Alexander, then I should wish to be Diogenes." While Diogenes is one of the most interesting figures from antiquity, I find him to be the most difficult ancient philosopher to apply to a modern context. Not, mind you, because of his urinating or defecating in public, or any of his shocking antisocial behavior, but rather because we are all inundated with, and are therefore inured to such behaviors. Such acts are no longer deemed revolutionary. When I first learned about Diogenes, I said to myself, if Diogenes were alive today, he would have a MacArthur grant and a private installation in the Museum of Modern Art. His urine and excrement would be on display in a pickle jar in the Guggenheim Museum, or valued at $10 million at auction. I can see him now, hanging out at the Cannes Film Festival with Banksy and Leonardo DiCaprio. Are there any acts that Diogenes performed in 412 BCE that, if performed today, could avoid being commoditized? Furthermore, once an artistic or philosophical gesture has a price tag on it, can it still be said to in any way be an act of defacing the currency? One thing is certain, any modern-day contemporary Diogenes would need to do a lot more than live in a barrel, defecate in public, or simply offend bourgeois sensibilities to get his message across. What could be more bourgeois in 2021 than offending bourgeois sensibilities? What would a 21st century, truly disruptive and effective Diogenes even begin to look like? I don't have an answer to this, but to begin to answer why this is such a difficult question, we need to jump forward in time to a 20th century philosopher, to Gilles Deleuze and his twin concepts of deterritorialization and reterritorialization. Deleuze was a French philosopher who worked from the 1950s up until his death in 1995. As a thinker, Deleuze is rather hard to categorize. He certainly gets the gold medal for difficult, obscure, impenetrable prose style. He had this reputation even amongst 20th century French theorists, who earned the team gold medal for obscure, impenetrable prose style. Before I attempt a definition of these terms, I should state upfront that deterritorialization and reterritorialization have been adopted and applied in many different fields and disciplines, from sociology, anthropology, to psychology and political science. This interpretation is not intended to be exhaustive. I hope my Deleuze professor isn't watching this, but if he is, I hope I'm doing these terms relative justice and not giving him an ulcer. I'll start with deterritorialization. As best as I can articulate it, deterritorialization is a description of what happens to the religious, cultural, and social structures of pre-modern societies once they encounter and become impacted by capitalism. Pre-modern societies were characterized by strongly enforced, non-negotiable cultural practices. Consider, for example, the feudal class system, or all of the taboos surrounding premarital sex, or consider the institution of marriage itself. These were all rigidly enforced cultural norms. Once capitalism begins to infiltrate traditional societies, it begins to dissolve these static political, cultural, and familial bonds. This is the act of deterritorialization. Capitalism accomplishes this by enabling anything to be exchanged for money. Before a society embraces capitalism, certain domains of society were part of the marketplace, and certain domains of life remained sacred and separate from commerce. Certain social hierarchies and customs remained immovable. In other words, they could not be traded for, liquidated, or commoditized. Exhibit A. Think of the class structure in pre-modern societies. Prior to capitalism, an aristocrat, someone from noble birth, would always remain more wealthy and more culturally powerful than a commoner. But with the advent of capitalism, there were no longer any cultural norms that would prevent a commoner, a merchant, for example, becoming more wealthy and influential than a baron or a duke. The old class structure has been deterritorialized. The previously held and enforced social boundaries have been removed. So, capitalism deterritorializes traditional cultural institutions, such as aristocracy. But as soon as these social norms are broken down, capitalism reterritorializes the energies and new potentialities that have been momentarily released from these customs, often in ways that are more alienating, constraining, and less fulfilling than the traditions which restricted and channeled these energies in the first place. Exhibit B. Let's examine sex and marriage. Marriage was a traditional social structure meant to restrain primal human desire and channel that energy into pro-social norms, namely family formation. In the West, the free love movement was a major component of the 1960s cultural revolution, and was the primary force which deterritorialized sexual desire and removed the cultural restraint of marriage. The propaganda at the time said that doing away with old, antiquated institutions like marriage would liberate human desire. Everyone would experience more joy, freedom, and creative potential, both within themselves and with one another, once everyone's lust, everyone's eros, was free of these antiquated restraints. Fast forward to the 21st century, and any honest assessment will come to the conclusion that we don't have free love. Or if we do, it hasn't resulted in any pro-social developments. Instead, what we have is explosive divorce rates, people forming families later in life and, when they finally get around to it, having fewer children. Sex was freed from the institution of marriage, only to immediately undergo greater commodification. What we experienced was not a free and unfettered liberation of desire. What we experienced was unfettered sexual addiction to the rise of pornography, of websites like OnlyFans. Premarital sex was destigmatized only to then immediately be commoditized. This commodification, this movement of a cultural practice from the domain of the sacred to the domain of the marketplace, is the act of reterritorialization performed by capitalism. Deterritorialization is always accompanied by reterritorialization, by a new power dynamic of commodification and a new system of constraints. Sex and desire once existed in a space outside of market forces, the sacred cultural domain of marriage. Capitalism deterritorialized desire out of this traditional context, only to reterritorialize it into the territory of the marketplace, where desire remains manipulated and constrained, where a dollar figure can now be assigned to it. I don't mean to sound naive here. I understand that prior to capitalism, there were brothels and prostitution, and that people got married for unsentimental reasons, for money or power. Or on the flip side, people did marry for purely sentimental, emotional reasons, and it wound up being a bad marriage to the wrong person. My point here is not that marriage, as an institution, guaranteed happiness and that everyone was always acting in good faith. But the traditional institution of marriage still had cultural hegemony. It was still a force that existed to channel and restrain desire, regardless of desire's motives, and redirected that energy in a way that was pro-social, that maintained and sustained cultural norms and led to family formation. Bad actors, people acting in bad faith, still had to pay deference to cultural norms and values. A calculating, ambitious, and unsentimental noblewoman may have attempted to marry the king, for example, but that raw ambition still had to bend the knee and conform its trajectory towards marriage. That marriage would still serve to bind one man to one woman, and more than likely result in children and the creation of a family. Compare that to today, where an ambitious and calculating woman can create an OnlyFans account and bind hundreds or even thousands of men to her economically. This relationship, if it can be called a relationship, is purely financial, purely transactional. It won't result in any children or family formation, or in sustaining or recapitulating any long-held cultural, communal practices. Let's return again quickly to the idea of class. Traditional social hierarchies in pre-modern societies maintained rigid class distinctions. Nobles and aristocrats always enjoyed more power, wealth, and prestige than people of common birth. Once capitalist economic systems began to evolve and wealth became less tied to feudal land ownership, these class distinctions began to dissolve and were eventually deterritorialized. In the West, we've all been educated from a young age to consider it an unequivocally good thing that political systems like monarchies and aristocracies were deterritorialized, though your 8th grade social studies teacher probably didn't use that exact term. How can the fact that one's station in life is no longer decided by the randomness of your birth be at all bad? Again, I don't wish to sound naive. Feudal systems, of course, had aspects to them that were brutal and inhumane and exploitive. But along with an aristocrat's wealth and station came the concept of noblesse oblige. Aristocrats had a responsibility to the peasants who labored on their land. It was the aristocrats' duty to make sure that their wards were fed and sheltered, to be the arbiter of disputes, and to defend them during times of war. A member of the landed gentry was beholden to their people and their land. This is what granted them their power and wealth, and formed a symbiotic relationship between ruler and ruled. In other words, certain rights and customs were deemed sacred. They existed outside of the marketplace. Compare this to today's deterritorialized aristocracy. Let's take one type of contemporary aristocrat as an example: venture capitalists or private equity firms. The elites that own and operate your corporation, or the corporation that owns your corporation, can decide tomorrow to move its entire operation 500 miles away from you. Or, for that matter, they can ship everything overseas. They are beholden to nobody, save perhaps their shareholders. VCs get all the wealth and prestige of an aristocrat, as well as the luxury of viewing themselves as nothing more than a smart, hard-working, and ambitious peasant. There is no longer any custom or social bond which makes them beholden to those who labor under them. Here's an interesting thought experiment. Let's say you're speaking with some modern, impoverished resident of the American Rust Belt, someone from Michigan who lost their job in the automotive industry when most of that industry went overseas. You present them with two scenarios. Scenario A: what if, instead of free market capitalists, the executives of Ford Motor Company had been land-holding aristocrats? What if Henry Ford had been the literal Duke of Michigan? Neither your grandfather nor you would ever have the right to vote him or any of his descendants out of their position. But the Fords would in turn never have the right to move their factories and businesses out of Michigan, or at least they would never be incentivized to do so. Under this regime, you may only ever be able to rise ever so far in life, but at a minimum, your children will have the same resources and opportunity at a livelihood as you. Your economic lives, you and the Ford family, would be fundamentally bound together. You and the Ford dynasty would both be stewards. Stewards of the past, present, and future of Michigan. Scenario B. You and the Ford family have complete and total social and economic freedom. There's nothing legally or culturally preventing you from having tens of millions of dollars or even amassing a fortune that would dwarf that of the Fords. But there's also nothing legally preventing the Fords from gutting your entire town. Scratch that, your entire county of its infrastructure and economy. You're both free and equal, right? It would be interesting to hear what someone would have to say. Make no mistake, there is still an aristocracy today. It's simply an aristocracy that has been deterritorialized from any specific region and locality, of any loyalty to a land, people, or any sense of noblesse oblige. Instead, our modern aristocracy only answers to the fluidity of the market. Free market, laissez-faire capital promised greater economic flourishing through neoliberalism, in the same way that the Cultural Revolution of the 60s promised greater personal flourishing through sexual liberty. The only thing either delivered was social and economic instability to the working class. Karl Marx had a great line that describes this phenomenon perfectly. Under capitalism, all that is solid melts into air. I know, I'm citing French postmodernists and now I'm quoting Marx. I promise I am not trying to gaslight everyone and that this is still by no means a left-leaning channel. But I have to hand it to them. When it comes to describing the spiritual degradation that people suffer under capital, left-wing critics can sometimes really turn a phrase or provide a revealing concept. It's a strange paradox that when French left-wing theorists discuss, quote, capitalism, they always seem to me to be incredibly high-minded and complex. But whenever I hear myself invoke capitalism, I cringe. I feel sophomoric, like I am once again a literal sophomore in high school, wearing my Nirvana t-shirt and having read 1/4 of the Communist Manifesto, feeling like I had everything figured out. I'm paraphrasing the YouTuber The Distributist here when I say that if capitalism simply means any economy utilizing free markets, and socialism or communism simply means any control or centralized oversight over markets, then we have at our fingertips two concepts that are so broad as to be effectively useless and meaningless. I agree with this observation, and yet I think we all can still sense, still intuit, this cultural degradation that continues to accelerate in Western, quote, capitalist countries. This malady is observed and agreed upon by dissident critics on both the left and the right. Perhaps the term modernity is more descriptive and less partisan than the term capitalism. Traditionalists on the right and many radical thinkers on the left can agree on this point. The great tragedy of modernity, our great crisis, is this continual cultural impoverishment and degradation. As modernity continues to deterritorialize and reterritorialize, to absorb more and more traditional, sacred aspects of culture and throw them to the thresher of the global marketplace, the tragedy of our epoch continues to escalate. But there's one aspect of our culture that, when deterritorialized and reterritorialized, goes beyond the dimension of the merely tragic, something that gives our circumstance a truly horrific dimension. The absorption of critique itself, the deterritorialization and reterritorialization of cultural criticism and cultural philosophy into mere cultural products to be consumed. This is what denies modern man our Diogenes. This is what prevents any true escape. No work of art has observed this phenomenon more clearly, more precisely, and more bleakly than the show Black Mirror. Black Mirror debuted on British television network Channel 4 in 2011. The show is a dystopian sci-fi horror series that has been described as the Twilight Zone for the digital age. To an extent, this comparison makes sense. Each episode is a standalone story, and each episode always deals with a fantastical premise. But unlike the Twilight Zone, Black Mirror's speculative elements always feel closer to home. The typical thematic premise to a Black Mirror episode is some form of disastrous new technology that results in a horrific disruption to life as we know it. The show creator Charlie Booker described the stories in Black Mirror as depicting the way we live now and the way we might be living in 10 minutes if we're clumsy. In the Twilight Zone episode Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, a character played by William Shatner is on an airline flight when he witnesses a terrifying gremlin lurking outside of his plane in mid-flight, tearing apart its wing. It's a fun and memorable episode, but I can't say I've lost any sleep over it. Compare this to the Black Mirror episode An Entire History of You, which presents us with the idea of a digital device called a grain. When implanted behind the ear, users can record everything they see and hear, as well as rewind and replay any previous moment from their life. Not only has this episode cost me sleep, I feel like I am closer to it being my waking reality each day. The horrors presented in Black Mirror are never fantasy creatures out of fairy tales on the wing of a plane. Instead, the monsters are always discomfortingly closer to our lived reality. The monster is the cell phone you're carrying in your pocket right now, or the computer screen you're gazing into for 12 hours a day. Someone had to point this out to me, and I was embarrassed at never having picked up on it, but the show's name, Black Mirror, in fact refers to a blank video screen. If you simply look at the screen of a modern tech device, a smartphone or a computer monitor or a tablet, you see your own reflection within the blackness of the screen. In another episode titled White Bear, the protagonist is a female convict found guilty of murder. Every day, she has her memory erased and undergoes psychological torment where visitors are allowed and encouraged to chase her and record her terror and suffering on their cell phones. Her prison serves a secondary purpose as an amusement park. This episode dates back to 2011, yet images from this episode today seem eerily similar to hundreds of videos you can find on YouTube or elsewhere of people aiming cell phones at one another like rifles, recording another person's fear while fleeing political demonstrations or being pursued by angry mobs. But it's in the episode 15 Million Merits where we encounter our modern-day Diogenes. 15 Million Merits presents a world in which people live entirely indoors within isolated cells. Every wall contains video screens which offer a selection of channels for personalized entertainment. These screens cover every inch of the prison-like cubes where people live, and are front and center in the only communal space that people occupy, a room set up like a fitness center spin class, with exercise bikes that everyone has to spend their days pedaling. We presume that the energy conducted by the pedaling is what acts as a power source for this dystopian society. Cyclists can earn currency known as merits, which they can then use to purchase food from a vending machine, accessorize their virtual avatars, or skip the constant advertisements for pornographic content. It's one of the episode's more frightening strokes of genius that people have to pay to avoid viewing pornography rather than to consume it. Everyone is subjected to endless forms of entertainment, and the merits can either buy you brief moments of respite or, more often, further their addictions to their entertainment. The bikes and the merit system keep everyone on a near literal hamster wheel of production and consumption. The protagonist of this episode, and our eventual Diogenes, is named Bing, played by Daniel Kaluuya. Like a sci-fi Bartleby the Scrivener, Bing alone remains aloof and detached from any of these modes of escapism on offer, embracing his boredom and melancholy, while all of his neighboring cyclists and cellmates seem to remain enthralled to one entertainment channel or another, along with the accompanying forms of merit spending. Because Bing isn't seduced by any distractions, he has been able to amass an enormous amount of merits, over 15 million, which he only spends on skipping pornographic adverts while living day-to-day in a fog of depression. The fog clears for Bing when a beautiful young woman, Abby Khan, played by Jessica Brown Finley, joins his exercise room, and he begins to develop feelings for her. There is one form of entertainment program available that stands out from the rest in its popularity. Hot Shots is a talent show reminiscent of Britain's Got Talent or American Idol. For the cost of 15 million merits, one can purchase a ticket to compete in the show and perform your talent to a panel of 3 judges. Winners can gain stardom, liberation from pedaling on bikes for a living, as well as greater accommodations than their cramped cells. After hearing Abby singing one day, Bing begins to encourage Abby to go on the program and offers to use his stock of merits to pay her way onto the show. Once she is convinced, Bing travels with Abby to the Hot Shots audition. Before she goes on stage, she is forced to take a drink which she is told will quell her anxiety, when in fact it appears to be a drug which renders her more compliant. After performing her song and having sung beautifully, the three judges initially seem impressed, but then state that her singing voice is only above average, as opposed to spectacular. Instead, they offer her a career on Wraith's Babes, one of the pornographic media channels. Under the influence of the drug and the encouragement of the judges and the audience, Abby accepts the offer as Bing desperately attempts to intervene and is restrained backstage. We next see Bing back to his daily routine and misery. Soon, however, he's exposed to a pornographic advertisement featuring Abby. Because he has spent all of his merits on her Hot Shots ticket, he doesn't have the funds to skip the ad and is subjected to Abby's pornographic debut. In a fit of rage, he shatters one of his screens. Once he finally calms down, Bing appears to have come up with a plan for revenge. He hides a shard of glass from the shattered screen under his bed. We are then treated to a montage in which we see Bing pedaling like mad, trying to work his way back up to 15 million merits. He scrounges discarded food out of the trash, works overtime, and pedals twice as fast as any of his neighbors. Time passes until he has eventually earned back 15 million merits, which he then uses to purchase an audition ticket to Hot Shots for himself. Once it's Bing's turn to step on stage, he begins with a dance routine. In the beginning, he seems to be impressing the judges. Then, his dance grows increasingly frantic and erratic. Suddenly, he stops and pulls the glass shard out of his sleeve and holds it to his neck. He warns everyone that he will kill himself if anyone takes a step closer to him, and proceeds to deliver a nihilistic speech about the horror and meaninglessness of their collective existence under this regime of control. Here is where Bing begins to take on a diegenic role. He is performing and enacting his philosophy, just as Diogenes walked backward through his marketplace and accused his contemporaries of walking backward along the whole path of existence. Here too, Bing is leveling a critique at his community. In refusing to march in lockstep and participate in the marketplace of Hot Shots, Bing is in effect walking backwards. Bing is attempting to deface the currency of the dehumanizing merit system. At first, the faces of the judges look as though they have truly absorbed what Bing has to say. But soon, the full scope of the horror sets in when the judges applaud the originality of his performance and offer him his very own program on one of the many entertainment channels, where he can offer up his bitter critiques on a weekly basis. Bing accepts the offer. In the final minutes of the episode, we see a cyclist watching Bing on his screen as he offers up one of his rants while holding the glass shard to his neck. We're shown that Bing now lives in a far more lavish cell, closer in appearance to an Upper West Side condo than a prison. He stands, sipping a glass of orange juice and staring at a panel showing a beautiful green forest. Whether it is an actual window leading to the natural world or whether it is just another false image on a screen is left for the viewer to determine for themselves. But what is made clear by this episode is that philosophizing, or cultural critique itself, offers no window of escape that may lead us back to nature. Once something has been deterritorialized and reterritorialized, once something has migrated from the sacred to the profane, there is no going back. 15 Million Merits depicts the process of deterritorialization and reterritorialization on several levels. Bing and Abby may have had a chance at a dedicated and loving relationship before Abby was absorbed into the hellish economics of the porn industry. With the three judges, we see aristocrats that no longer need to hold the interests of the lower classes in mind. Instead, they only pursue their own wealth and prestige while encouraging everyone else's vices. But it's the deterritorialization of Bing's cry of anguish, of his poetic expression, and its reterritorialization into an entertainment commodity that makes the horror of this episode so haunting and memorable. There is no heroic gesture that can free Bing, and by extension, the viewers, from this process. There is no release or escape from modernity, from the eternal feedback loop of instrumental enslavement. There is no coin that you could possibly deface that capitalism won't still gladly accept as currency. Anyways, I should probably finally get to the scariest Black Mirror episode I ever saw, given the title of this video and everything. There's a quote from Dostoevsky that applies perfectly to Black Mirror. Here's how it goes. Evil lies deeper in human beings than our social physicians suppose. The laws of the human soul are still so little known, so obscure to science, so undefined and so mysterious that there are not and cannot be either physicians or final judges. When I think of who our social physicians are today, the phrase brings to mind for me our ruling Silicon Valley technocrats. Obviously, this couldn't have been who Dostoevsky had in mind. Russia was dealing with its own self-anointed social physicians in the form of communists during his time. But whether it's brought about by communists or technologists, negative, disruptive social changes have always seemed to me a result of naive optimism towards the human soul, an underestimation of human nature and our capacity for evil. Did Jack Dorsey really and truly set out to create a platform that incentivizes our worst emotions, shatters our attention spans, disincentivizes critical thinking and civil discourse? Or did he actually have a positive vision of something more utopian in mind? Men like Dorsey or Zuckerberg aren't so much deliberately evil people, willfully bringing about chaos, so much as they are simply naive. They are believers in progress, in human perfectibility. They believe that our flaws and frailties are something that can be remedied, like modern-day Victor Frankensteins in deploying new social technologies. They were toying with the human soul in ways they could not comprehend. In attempting to act as physicians or final judges, they've tampered with things nobody ever should. And in trying to improve humanity, or help humanity reach its full potential, they instead bring us closer and closer to facing the horrors that lie in the hearts of men. Like a professor at Lovecraft's Miskatonic University, no Bay Area entrepreneur knew that when they cracked open the Necronomicon and began to read aloud the arcane letters, that they were opening an eldritch portal and unleashing Cthulhu onto the world. The title Black Mirror is so fitting because the show reflects back our hubris, our naivete about human nature. Each episode shows us a window onto our own souls, unlocked by some innovative technology, opening onto chaos, onto further deterritorialization of social bonds, onto our own limitless capacity for evil. It's a window that should have remained shut. Black Mirror is a perfect artistic expression of Dostoevsky's insight. Or, at least, it was. Black Mirror was purchased by Netflix in 2015, and, as with many other intellectual properties Netflix subsumes, I soon began to notice a change. Not only a change in production quality and tone, but a change in philosophy and orientation. The USS Callister was the premiere episode of Black Mirror's 4th season. Robert Daly, played by Jesse Plemons, is a socially stunted yet talented programmer who is co-founder of a hugely successful, massive multiplayer online game. The story jumps back and forth between his day job as CTO of his company, where he feels underappreciated and outshined by his more charismatic business partner and CEO, James Walton, played by Jimmy Simpson, and his inner fantasy world, a world which, we soon discover, is more than mere fantasy. Robert has created a virtual reality world on his private server where he lives a second life as the captain of the USS Callister, an obvious parody of the original 1960s-era Star Trek. Robert himself exists here as a sadistic, tyrannical, and omnipotent version of Captain James T. Kirk, possessing godlike powers over his environment. We quickly learn that this reality is not merely a simulation. Robert has been stealing DNA from colleagues and creating fully conscious, sentient replicas, which are forced to live on inside his simulated world. While in real life he remains reserved and submissive to his office mates and business partner, within the simulation he torments their doubles. inflicting violence or sexual abuse on anyone whose real-life analog manages to offend him on any given day, or when the clones disobey his commands, deliberately or accidentally interrupting his own fantasies. Back in reality, a new programmer named Nanette Cole, played by Kristen Milioti, is starting her first day at work. When she briefly meets Robert, she appears starstruck and tells him how much she admires his work before being whisked away by James. In short order, Robert finds Nanette's discarded coffee cup and extracts her DNA from it, creating a replicant of her on his personal server. Here, the episode switches perspectives, and Nanette's Star Trek clone serves as our protagonist for the remainder of the story. She materializes onto the deck of the USS Callister, clad in an absurdly skimpy uniform and a beehive hairdo, both obvious nods to the over-sexualized costumes of the original Star Trek series. Disoriented and terrified, her fellow clones explain to her what has happened. Initially, she attempts to resist and escape. Because Robert can exercise complete control over this world, he simply teleports her back onto the ship and removes her mouth, suffocating her until she agrees to be more compliant. I don't think a full episode recap is necessary. Robert forces the crew members to act out space missions, where he can act as the hero as usual, while Nanette persuades the crew to help her outsmart and eventually wrest control of their world from Robert. They first set about this task through finding a way to email the IRL Nanette, and then blackmailing her by leaking nude photos of her on the internet if she doesn't steal DNA samples from Robert's apartment. The details don't really matter here, but by the end of the episode, the crew members have triumphed and Robert is trapped inside the game, all alone inside the dark cockpit of a tiny spaceship, assumedly for all eternity, while back in the real world, his body appears to be in a comatose state. Having punished Robert, the crew initially attempts to commit collective suicide and end their tortured existence by flying the Callister into a wormhole. Instead, the crew of clones finds themselves all alive and well, having been rebooted onto the live MMO. The episode concludes as the clones all decide to continue living within the MMO, pursuing episodic sci-fi adventures, now with Nanette in charge. This episode went on to receive more awards and critical praise than any other Black Mirror episodes to date, including 4 Primetime Emmy Awards. So, why is this the scariest Black Mirror episode I've ever seen? Well, on the immediate superficial level, it's not hard to see why a reactionary would have issues with the USS Callister. While on the micro level, the episode details the revenge fantasies of a stereotypical 4chan troll, an overdone cartoon villain erupting from a collective, paranoid left-wing fever dream, like Athena emerging from the head of Zeus. The episode on the macro level is itself an elaborate, progressive revenge fantasy, enacted against the perceived misogyny within nerd culture. The pettiness it attempts to critique is dwarfed by the pettiness it exudes. In fact, this aspect is so obvious that it feels as if USS Callister were actually baiting right-wingers to come after it. And perusing the internet, many did, though not as many as I would expect and not to a satisfactory depth. But this video is certainly overly long and ponderous if my only point is that Black Mirror went woke. It's not the first intellectual property to do so, and it won't be the last. And it's not as if the show was ever explicitly right-wing in its signaling, or explicitly political in any sense before now. Though in some sense I do believe that horror as a genre is fundamentally right-wing at its deepest level. But we will get to that later. Like most every other Black Mirror episode, USS Callister does manage to feel close to home, and topical in its subject matter. This episode coincided with the height of the Me Too movement, with everything coming to light about Harvey Weinstein. Though it is, strangely, played for laughs, the episode includes an incident of revenge porn. Shadows of Gamergate also permeate the narrative. I don't think it's coincidental that the actress Kristen Milioti bears a passing resemblance to Anita Sarkeesian. The episode also concerns itself with the past, with the antiquated misogyny, now nearly 60 years old, of the original Star Trek. Little to no ammunition seems to have been overlooked when loading this progressive gun. These observations are true, but only scratching the surface and don't relate immediately to what makes this the scariest episode of all time. One might also comment, and many have, on the break in tone that the USS Callister enacts. When I was conducting research for this video, I came across an IndieWire article titled, 3 Ways Netflix's Black Mirror Broke the Rules with USS Callister. For a brief moment, I thought my work was potentially already done, that this video would be both extremely late to the game and completely superfluous. Needless to say, I was wrong. The 3 infractions that the article lists are utterly toothless. They are as follows. 1. It's longer than most Black Mirror episodes. 2. It's science fiction. 3. It switches protagonists mid-story. We can skip Rule 1 and 3 on their face. Nobody cares and nothing rides on these. But number 2, it's science fiction, is worth exploring. The episode is certainly lighter in tone, both in terms of its pacing and color palette. Other Black Mirror episodes have employed comedy, but a blacker comedy than anything we see here. Its narrative structure presents more of an action-adventure story than the slower, more ponderous episodes of the past. But surely other previous Black Mirror episodes could be arguably categorized as science fiction. Indeed, all of them would have to be considered speculative fiction, at the very least. Is the greater issue at stake here, perhaps, not so much the fact that the episode is clearly science fiction, but that it is clearly not horror? The article does not go on to make this point. But these 2 genres have certainly had no problem overlapping with one another in the past. The Alien and Predator franchises, or films like Event Horizon, come immediately to mind. I'm actually in agreement with this article that USS Callister is purely science fiction and cannot be considered horror, though this episode takes some pretty cynical and flagrant steps to dodge and deflect the accusation that it has moved Black Mirror outside of the horror genre. Let's confront those now. About halfway through the story, the digital clone of Walton, Robert's CEO and business partner, explains why he refuses to help Nanette try and overthrow Robert. After a previous coup attempt, Robert created a clone of his little boy, Tommy, and threw him out an airlock as a form of punishment. Every time I have tried to have a conversation with friends about what is at stake, what is getting subverted in this episode, this scene gets brought up and thrown in my face. What do you mean Black Mirror is no longer about horror? They threw a kid out of an airlock. I've heard this point made again and again. Firstly, this scene is utterly discordant in tone with the rest of this episode. In fact, I'm quite confident that this scene was welded onto the script to preemptively dismiss anyone uncomfortable with the stylistic and ideological changes to the show that they would clearly see transpiring here. Let me be perfectly clear just how cynical I think that this scene is. I think that some EP or assistant director went up to Charlie Booker and said, "Say boss, what if some high IQ, big-brained reactionary type starts to blow the whistle on the internet about how we've utterly betrayed the aesthetic and philosophical sensibilities of this beloved franchise?" Then, I think Charlie Booker blowed a bubble with his bubble gum and said, "Meh, add a scene where Plemons throws a kid out of an airlock. That'll put an end to their parlor room conversations." Yes, I literally think some version of this conversation took place. But shocking, grotesque, superfluous violence, even when it's performed on children, does not necessarily determine whether or not a piece of fiction or film is horror, as we will see. It goes without saying that none of these 3 transgressions are what makes USS Callister the scariest Black Mirror episode I've ever seen, with the possible exception of number 2 when viewed in a certain light. I'm going to attempt my own revision of the 3 ways in which USS Callister broke the rules. 1. It locates evil as something outside the human soul. The YouTuber The Distributist put out a video some time ago called Call of Cthulhu, Lovecraft, and Why Horror is Reactionary. It's one of his best, and I owe many of these observations to him. I'll include a link to it in the description. Amongst other topics, The Distributist examines the somewhat recent phenomenon of the progressive-oriented pseudo-horror film typified by directors like Guillermo del Toro. In del Toro's films, the true horror, the true evil within the film, is never his iconic, visually stunning monsters, but always instead some authoritarian white male. In Pan's Labyrinth, we see this in the Francoist Captain Vidal, In The Shape of Water, we see this in the role of Colonel Richard Strickland. Captain Robert Daly of the USS Callister fits perfectly into this new mold typified by Del Toro. To quote the Distributist in describing these characters, they are, quote, simultaneously pathetic and in possession of an unending capacity for cruelty. Here, ire can safely be placed. He is the antagonist, a pathetic one who exists to be defeated, and possesses no real horror unto himself, other than the physical intimidation he is able to bring to a scene before his eventual defeat. We are led to hate these men, but nobody is afraid of them in any real sense. End quote. The Distributist later provides us with a progressive definition of evil, and I quote again, "Evil is a thing that a certain class of people do, or did, 50 years ago, that we are now beyond, as opposed to the notion that evil is eternally springing up from the human soul. To the progressive, evil is something that happens, that perpetuates itself for a time before it is ultimately solved and we move on." In the previous Black Mirror episodes we have discussed, it would be hard to pinpoint any overt human villain. Who is the villain of 15 Million Merits? Who is the villain of White Bear? If there can be said to be any villain, it only exists in such an abstract sense as to make the villain impossible to face or overcome. The villain in earlier Black Mirrors was simply our own inner capacity for collective technological and instrumental enslavement. The fact that our human desire for perfection and advancement inevitably becomes aggregated and twisted into a new form of captivity. The villain, the horror, is that our own innate, inescapable evil ensures that we participate in our own enslavement, that we are the machine of our own perpetual deterritorialization. And so a fundamental problem with USS Callister is not that it is categorically progressive, though it certainly is. The problem is that progressivism categorically denies evil, or at the very least, progressivism categorizes evil as something political as opposed to personal, as external as opposed to internal. Any work of art is doomed as soon as it prioritizes politics over the artwork itself. In embracing an explicit politics, Black Mirror has no choice but to turn its back on its core insights about human nature and to externalize evil. Rule 2. Technology is no longer the gateway to evil, or, to put it another way, technology is no longer that which deterritorializes. While technology still plays a role and is part of the theme of the USS Callister, that role has fundamentally changed. In older Black Mirror episodes, as we have discussed, technology operates as that which opens a window unto man's soul. It acts as Pandora's box. Technology is capitalism's chthonic gate, its magic wand of deterritorialization and reterritorialization. Technology is, in some felt sense, that unnameable thing within us. If not evil itself, it's that key which unlocks that evil inside us all. In White Bear, law and order, crime and punishment have become desacralized and commoditized as a form of entertainment. In The Entire History of You, a family is torn apart due to a technology that records everything users can see and hear. In 15 Million Merits, Bing's line of flight from his captivity is co-opted and reterritorialized by the entertainment industry. In the USS Callister, the dark potentiality of technology, and by extension, the dark potentiality of capitalism itself, is left completely unexplored. Technology is only an instrument of evil insofar as it has fallen into the hands of an evil, authoritarian white man. The viewer is provided with a scapegoat and is absolved from evil as opposed to being implicated. The viewer is permitted to scoff at evil and stand outside it in a way that Black Mirror never before permitted. The technology that allows Robert to clone his colleagues and upload them to his server is certainly an elaborate torture device, but it is only such because of Robert's pre-existing malevolence. It doesn't disrupt the social bonds between Robert and others, since they were never there to begin with. On top of that, all of the characters, both the heroes and villains are employed at a video game company maintaining a hugely successful MMORPG. Is the virtue in dedicating one's life to maintaining a highly addictive, artificial world for people to inhabit ever called into question or put on trial? No. In fact, as soon as the evil of Robert Daly is vanquished, the heroes are left to revel in their digital environment. Which brings me to our third broken rule. 3. Evil is resolved. The monster Robert Daly is vanquished, and in resolving evil, in presenting evil as something that can ever be resolved, the USS Callister ends up defending the status quo. It's highly ironic that USS Callister has received such accolades for being subversive. A show that is so smug and self-assured in its subversiveness is so utterly reinforcing of the status quo. I'm sure that the episode's creators have exactly the opposite sense of what this episode is doing. It's speaking truth to power. It's going after the Weinsteins, the abusers, the cis-het white men who sit upon the Iron Throne. But the USS Callister sits atop the Iron Throne of mainstream moral outrage, of the woke sensibilities that were in ascendance by the time the USS Callister aired. To quote from the Distributist once again, good horror utilizes the fact that, deep down, humans understand that true evil exists. It exists and needs to be confronted, and its confrontation is not an excuse for the status quo. As a matter of fact, most of the time, the status quo generated that very evil. Great horror, I would say, always goes a step further, and reminds the human subject that they are the source, that this anathema that might extinguish everything good about the universe blooms eternal in their own souls. Yes, men hold positions of power. Yes, many men abuse that power in terrible, evil ways. Yes, these men need to be confronted and dealt with, as Nanette and the crew of the USS Callister confront Robert Daly. But have they truly confronted evil in and of itself, in any sense? I find the idea that the status quo, much of the time, is what generates evil, to be an idea worth dwelling on for a moment. Could the status quo be responsible for creating a monster like Robert Daly? The figure of the incel, the MGTOW, the woman-hating autistic programmer presented by Robert Daly is a cultural archetype that has come about as a result of a deterritorialized sexual marketplace. A marketplace which leaves many socially awkward young men behind, that creates both extravagant winners and extravagant losers. I don't mean to excuse the sadistic behavior of this character for a moment, or to imply that anyone owed him anything, sexually or socially, but it occurs to me that the Black Mirror of the early days would have been interested in exploring this as its focal point, the point of the monster's inception, of Robert's deterritorialization from a social order that may have, at one point, had an actual place for him. But the camera is no longer focused on the would-be social physicians and their acts of deterritorialization. Dr. Frankenstein is now standing confidently behind the camera, aiming its lens at its monster and inviting us to hurl rocks and stones. Once the monster is dead, we are assured, evil shall be vanquished. USS Callister's defense of the status quo goes beyond merely redirecting our attention away from the sights and causes of deterritorialization. The USS Callister also invites us, to borrow a phrase from Zizek, to enjoy our symptom. Back at the end of 15 Million Merits, we see Bing quietly staring out his window. Whether his environment is any less synthetic, any less a place of captivity, or any less deterritorialized is left up to the viewer. The trees he sees out the window could be just another simulacrum. If it's any kind of victory, it is certainly a Pyrrhic one. At the end of the USS Callister, however, there is no such doubt. The crew members of the Callister are left inside a simulation, a giant MMORPG, and they could not be more thrilled by their enslavement, as they boldly go forward to keep themselves entertained. The crew members remain as captive to their environment as Bing, but this is no tragedy. This is not an instance of horror. Rather, their great unfreedom is viewed as triumphant. the characters will never have any goals greater than the goals their technological world has devised for them. And yet the show tries to persuade us that good has triumphed over evil. When I first set out to make this video, I had the clever notion that I would show us how the USS Callister is what manages to deterritorialize Black Mirror itself, that it robbed the show of its liberating potentiality. I would show how what happened to Bing would eventually happen to the TV program that dared to show us his doomed, diagenic performance. But the truth of the matter is, Black Mirror was always deterritorialized. It was always a commodity, something that I was consuming. While the themes of episodes like White Bear, The Entire History of You, and 15 Million Merits felt subversive, none of them managed to transform my life in any way. The reality is closer to this. Black Mirror was already a wall hanging in a museum I can never leave, and where I spectate and consume. And Black Mirror is certainly one of my favorite pieces within it. As I trudge through the halls, I visit the various wings and exhibits, the Banksy installations or the bust of Diogenes, and I would frequently stop to gaze into the Black Mirror, a haunting piece that always made me feel a little unsettled, like if I stared at my reflection in it long enough, it started staring back at me. Then, one day, when I went to visit the piece, I saw that it had been removed. There was no Black Mirror. In its place, there stood a bright, well-lit vanity mirror, complete with powders and perfumes and eyeliner. When I turned to ask the guard what happened to the piece, he said to me, "Don't you find this new installation more pleasant? People can't stop talking about it." It was that day that I discovered that just because a story describes our own impotence doesn't mean that it will escape castration. What could be scarier than that? If you have any more interest in learning about the work of Gilles Deleuze, I wanted to take a moment to plug the work of Deleuze scholar Justin Murphy and his book, Base Deleuze. I want to make it clear that all of the opinions stated in this video are my own and haven't necessarily met with his endorsement. He's simply an incredible resource on Deleuze. In addition, Justin offers fantastic academic courses through his platform Other Life. What Uber did to taxis, Justin is trying to do to the university system. He's deterritorializing academia, but in a good way. If you miss college or ever thought about going to grad school in the humanities but couldn't rationalize the crippling debt and poverty of the enterprise, these courses scratch that itch and are a great alternative. They are intensive, taught by world-renowned scholars, and are very affordable. I've included links to Murphy's content in the show notes. Until next time, thanks for watching.